In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to rehab an ACL injury, and I'm going to be covering off some of the major problems with ACL rehab, some of the key challenges, how to provide the solutions to this, and then a 5-phase model that we use to help clients to get back to sport after a traumatic injury like an ACL. So to begin with, what are the main problems? Well, the first one is that an ACL is one of the most serious, and it can keep athletes out for 9 to 12 months at a time. So obviously a very significant injury to deal with and can take you out of sport for a long period of time. Other injuries, muscular injuries or more minor sprains can take you out for a couple of weeks. But when you're talking about possibly a year out from sport, sometimes even longer, it's obviously a very significant thing to have to deal with. So there's challenges there, not just from a physical standpoint, but also from a psychological standpoint as well, because you've got to deal with changes of identity. Sometimes you've got to deal with the pressures and the challenges along the way of the rehab process. There's a lot to deal with during this time. The other one is that there's often a lack of criteria-based functional assessments when largely generic rehab processes are followed. And oftentimes I hear this all the time, but athletes will tell me that they've just been told that because time has passed, because they've done 6 weeks of rehab, they can move to the next phase, or because they've done X, Y, Z for a period of time that they're able to go back to sport. And I remember very clearly there was an athlete I used to work with who was told by the surgeon that because a certain number of months had passed that she was able to go back to sport. But having done functional assessment, it was just so obvious that she was a long way from returning yet. So you've got to be very clear that time is one component, but criteria are far more important, because that gives you the clarity that to get to the next stage, you have to pass these criteria. To get back to sport, you have to have ticked off lots of boxes. In doing so, it just gives you clarity and it gives you confidence. And that confidence comes belief in yourself, belief in the knee. And that's a massive factor in a successful return to sports. There's also a high risk of re-injury. Up to 38% of athletes who fail the return to sport criteria suffer a re-injury versus only 5% of those who pass them. So if you don't have criteria in place, the risk of you getting hurt again is very high, unfortunately. But it's no surprise, because when else would this make sense? When else would you be told, oh, well, time's passed, you're good to go? Imagine learning to drive and your driving instructor says, oh, well, you've been learning for 2 months now, so you're okay to pass. Like, you just wouldn't make any sense, would it? You'd want to know that you've passed certain things, you've showed competency in certain skills, you've demonstrated you're functionally capable of driving a car in different conditions. You've had a test where you've had a bit more pressure applied and you've managed to pass that, without any major issues there, and you've passed the criteria they're looking for. You've demonstrated knowledge. All of those things you've got to do, because it's a significant thing to have that responsibility to drive a car on the road. But it's also a significant responsibility to put your body back in sport if you haven't passed those assessments too. So this highlights just how important it is that you do pass criteria before you go back. The solution, therefore, is to have clear guidelines. And what this does above everything else is it provides you with clarity, because so much of the challenge of any injury like this is that you don't have clarity of when will I be back, how will I know what to do, what things am I supposed to be doing here, and all the overwhelm that comes with it. So you want to have clear guidelines to follow, assessment targets, benchmarks, and clear criteria at every different stage. Time-based rehab isn't enough. And without functional assessment, you really can't be sure that you're fully fit. So functional assessment is really important. I'll give you some examples of different functional assessments at the different 5 phases. But without those, you don't know you're fully fit for sport yet. So that's massively important as well. And lastly, then you want to have 5 phases. Now, it doesn't have to be 5, but this is the setup that I use and have used successfully with athletes to return to sport. But as long as you've got clear criteria every phase to work through, then you know what your targets are at every given point, you know what numbers to hit, and then you know when you're ready to go to the next level. And another analogy I would use here is, if you are in that car again, imagine driving without a dashboard. Imagine not knowing how fast you were going, how many revs you were, how many revs the engine was producing, oil levels, engine temperatures, all the things that you need to know to make sure the car is operating at a safe, functional level, and not having any of that information. That would be very, very difficult, wouldn't it? And you wouldn't have any clarity of, am I speeding? Am I going to run out of petrol? How long have I been driving for? All those things. It would give you massive amounts of anxiety. imagine the same thing applied to this situation. We've had a long-term ACL rehab and you haven't got any of those numbers at all. You're just completely in the dark on what am I supposed to be aiming for, what are my scores, all of those things. You wouldn't have any information at all. So you've got to have clear criteria because it just gives you so much clarity along the way. And this is ultimately the system that I use. It's the system I've designed called the Elite ACL Rehab system. Got 5 phases, and they are rebuild, reactivate, restore, return, and retain. So it's 5 R's and easy to remember. And I'm going to break those 5 down for you in just a second. But long story short, what we're looking to do is to move through in a sequential manner. So it's always the same step-by-step process, starting in phase 1 and working through each of the 5 have got different criteria to aim for. Phase 4 is when you actually go back to sport, and phase 5 is what happens after sport. And there are some key considerations for that, which sometimes get forgotten as well. So that's a massively important factor. So in phase 1, and I'm just going to move myself out of the way there. In phase 1, we've got rebuild. And what we're really looking to do here is to allow, first of all, the body to regenerate and to rebuild itself post-surgery, when your body's going to be dealing with the surgery itself, the swelling, the graft site itself is going to be dealing with inflammation and lots of other factors like that. It's important to take things steady and not rush. The main aims here are to get knee extension, knee flexion, and quadriceps activation. Some of the research will give you different numbers to aim for, but as a ballpark for full knee extension, we're looking for, as it suggests, 0 degrees, so full knee extension, and ideally 5 degrees of hyperextension, which means obviously going beyond that full extension point. And that can be assessed both actively or passively. In other words, actively would be you testing it yourself and trying to engage the quadriceps to achieve that full knee extension, or with the use of hands-on physical therapist, S&C coach who can assess this in a passive way, doing the same thing, looking at how much extension you can achieve in the knee and working towards these targets over a number of weeks. It's not going to be something you're going to rush into or try and push the knee too much. It needs to be done in a logical way. Knee flexion, similarly, you want to have a number of around 125 degrees or more. And then lastly, quadricep activation, because that's one of the key things that happens early on. Your body essentially switches off the kind of neural drive towards the quadricep muscles to essentially protect the knee. Makes a lot of sense because you don't want to be sending a lot of neural signals to the muscle to fire up and to produce lots of force in an injured joint. It wouldn't make a lot of sense, but it does obviously make the rehab process harder because you're trying to forcibly make a muscle activate whilst the brain's trying to switch it off. This is why things like electrical stimulation can be helpful. So things like using a complex, very, very helpful because it allows you to get essentially like an artificial electrical stimulus into the muscle and teach it to fire up again and rewire that central nervous system. And that can also help with full knee extension because the better quad activation, the more able you are to achieve knee extension because the prime mover in knee extension is the quadricep muscle group. Knee flexion, similarly, what we can do here is, muscles around the knee obviously are going to be having reduced neural activation. So again, trying to achieve this via electrical stimulation can be a very helpful thing. Now, a few factors in the stage to consider. The first is that patients who had a flexion deficit of 5 degrees had double the odds of sustaining a graft rupture. So even 5 degrees, which doesn't seem like a lot, can have a significant contributing factor to the risk of graft rupture. In other words, the rupture to the surgery itself, post-surgery having a secondary injury, is double the risk when you've got a deficit of 5 degrees. And that's why it's important, again, to have these criteria, because if you didn't know that, you didn't have a number to aim for, and you were just kind of blindly trying to achieve a bit more knee flexion, and you didn't have a clear idea of phase 1, 125 plus degrees of knee flexion, and you then just moved on to the next phase and tried to get back to sport and running as quick as you can do, you'd skip this important step, and the risk of injury here is obviously significant. Now, same thing with knee extension, a deficit of more than 5 degrees. So the opposite here being that if you were starting from a position of 0 being the target, so that's full extension, then not being able to achieve that slightly by about 5 degrees is associated with anterior knee pain. Now, why would that be? Very simply, it's because your your joint is going to be experiencing more pain if you don't get activation to the muscles that support it, because the joint itself is going to be experiencing a greater degree of stress and load. So you want to make sure, again, achieving this activation in the quadricep muscles, because that's going to allow the muscle to do its job, essentially. And finally, anterior knee pain is also associated with quadricep weakness, independent of the graft type used. So whether you're having a patella tendon graft, quadricep graft, whether you're having a hamstring graft, doesn't really matter what type of graft it is. If you get anterior knee pain, you get quadricep weakness. And so it kind of becomes this vicious cycle if we don't address this problem. What it says here is that if you get pain, you get weakness. And if there's weakness, you get pain. So you can see how breaking this cycle is massively important. And again, why trying to reduce inflammation, increase activation, trying to get full extension is the most important thing early on in the rehab process. Once you've achieved that, then we get to move on. Now, in phase 2, which is all about reactivating those muscle groups again, trying to increase tissue capacity and force development in the key muscle groups that support the knee. The key thing here is trying to reduce asymmetry. So what we're looking to do is get some of the key scores down below 15% of asymmetry between the left and the right side. So an example of this would be hamstring capacity through things like a single leg bridge, single leg balance, single leg squat to a box, some adductor strength development, massively important for knee stability and control, calf, which supports, again, the knee enormously, and then some lower body maximal strength scores like a back squat, or ideally something like a single leg press where you can isolate the knee without any kind of axial loading or other variables that are kind of going to contribute to that force production. You kind of just want to see how much force that leg can produce independently of other muscle groups. So you can either use a back squat, or you can use a single leg press, or you can use a combination of both. But ultimately what we're trying to do here is build back strength, build back the capacity to prepare for running. And so if you can achieve all of these key scores and they're within 15%, then we're basically in a positive position to transfer and move forwards into the restore phase. The restore phase becomes much more about athletic capabilities. It becomes about more around explosive power and running. And what we can do here is introduce, to begin with, linear running. We can then introduce some higher speed linear running. Then we can introduce slower speed multi-directional running. And then finally, looking to, in phase 4, introduce sport-specific high-speed reactive agility movements. In this phase, we're also trying to introduce some hopping-based movements or dynamic control-based movements and plyometrics, because, again, to prepare for a return to sport, it's not just about being able to produce force slowly or to demonstrate a whole lot of capacity in a muscle group. It's important that you can also produce force very quickly in small time frames, which is where plyometrics come in. Teaching muscle groups, again, to produce force in short time periods, which is reflective of sport, where things generally are fast, explosive. There's jumping, there's landing, there's throwing, there's catching, tackling, whatever the sport might be. It's always in short time frames. It's not over long duration. So once you've got a foundation of strength built in phase 2, we can then progress into more plyometric focused work in phase 3, where we can introduce plyometrics and sprinting work as well. Phase 4 then finally is where we're preparing for a return to sport. So we have achieved full extension, we've achieved quadricep activation, we've achieved capacity, we've achieved the strength scores, we've achieved control and explosive power on a single leg. We're now in a position to get assessed for a return to sport. And this phase, again, it depends completely on the individual, but generally speaking, the 9-month mark is generally advisable. Although for younger athletes, sometimes it can be up to sort of 12 months, because some of the research has suggested it can take a little longer for a youth athlete, and there's no point in rushing this stuff. We want to make sure we're doing it properly. What ultimately we do is use the Melbourne ACL protocol to gather a score. What this does is it covers a massive range of things. It covers your mindset around the injury. So whether you've got a fear of re-injury or not, your confidence in the knee, functional assessment, in other words, the things we looked at already, so strength scores, capacity scores, jumping based scores, asymmetry differences, and finally we look at your performance under fatigue as well. So you're going to do a kind of general fitness test that's associated with your sport. Let's say you're a hockey player, which is a sport that I specialize in. Then you might use something like a 30-15 or a 16 pitch lengths run to look at your mass score. If you were a netballer, you might use a repeat sprint score. If you were a marathon runner, you'd obviously use a longer distance run as a marker, but something that's going to be a measure of your aerobic conditioning, cardiovascular health, going back to sport. Taking into consideration all of these scores, then what we do is we create a finalized score. And because it's so comprehensive, you need to try to achieve a score of 95 or above in the Melbourne ACL score. Once you've achieved that, you're basically given the green light to return to sport, which is obviously the main thing we're aiming to do here. Lastly, then, in the retain phase, this is where you're now back playing sports. You've passed the ACL protocol, you've passed the test, you've got 95 or above. You don't just want to stop at this point. And the reason for that is this graph here, which I referred to earlier around the percentage risk of re-injury. So the key is to avoid re-injury following a long rehab process, because you don't want to do all this work and then just stop doing any work altogether, because obviously your body adapts and then it stops adapting as soon as it's not given an overload stimulus or it's not continued to be challenged over time. And again, just to reiterate, there's a 38% risk of re-injury for those who don't pass the criteria. So let's say even if we have passed the criteria, and again, I'll just move myself out of the way. You can see the difference here. So if you've got, there's a rate of knee injury by a percentage, and then how long after a return to sport. The solid line here is those who failed return to sport, and then you've got the pass line, the dotted line, are those who passed it. And what you can see is this flat line where even up to 18 months post-sport, there is a very minimal 5% risk of re-injury if you've passed all of these different criteria. If you don't pass the criteria, then the risk up to 18 months, we're up to 38%, and that trend obviously looks like it's continuing to climb. So the risk would be smaller in the shorter time frame, but what happens is because we haven't addressed the underlying problem, the risk grows and grows and grows because we're not doing any continued work during this phase as well. So actually what happens is the risk increases the longer we wait, because we're still not doing the work that we kind of were doing in the rehab phase. So even if you're on this dotted line where you've passed the phase 4 criteria and you've done everything really, really well, what you don't want to do is just kind of rest on your laurels here and think, okay, cool, I've passed the criteria, I'm good to go. Because there's always a risk of re-injury, even if it's 5%. You want to make this risk as small as possible, don't you? You don't want to do all that amazing work over a number of months, then go back to sport and then just stop doing anything altogether. So that's why it's so important that you address this and continue to do the work even after you've had the injury. So I hope that's been a useful overview of how to work through a 5-phase model. I haven't given you kind of specific exercises aside from the kind of assessments, but that's something which I'll be looking to do at a later date. But I hope that just gives you a rough framework for the 5 phases you've got to go through, the rationale behind it, the research that supports the risk of re-injury if you don't follow something like this, and how it can help you get back to sport faster and with more clarity.